I would briefly explain what that means from my perspective. It's like this. We are simply being spied on by many devices and companies, I would say so. In principle, we all wear smartwatches. We have smart devices around us. Our cars collect a lot of data about us, about our actions, about what we like, about our needs, desires, and so on. Then there are also personalized data profiles that companies collect about us. Thus, companies have a very, very, very large amount of data about us. And that's why it's called the transparent human, because companies know a great deal.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Shall Be C-Level Priority, the podcast that puts the digital world to the test. Cyber attacks are on the rise, and data is the most valuable asset in today's world. But how can we protect what matters most to us? Drawing on the latest insights, effective strategies, and practical tools, we'll show you how to create a more secure digital environment. Because one thing is clear: security isn't negotiable. It's a top priority.
Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Cybersecurity Chefsache, the OUTS podcast. Today with Bronislava, and I tell you, pronouncing this name was already a big challenge for me. Names are a huge topic for me, but I'm all the more pleased that you're here today.
Hello, thank you very much for allowing me to be here.
For those who don't know you yet, tell us a few sentences about yourself.
Yes, my name is Bronislava. I originally come from Ukraine. I came to Germany when I was 5 years old, and lived in Germany for 21 years, studied business law there in various departments, like legal departments and industries. And then about 2 years ago, I emigrated from Germany, now live in Malta. And with the emigration, I also became self-employed as an external data protection officer and information security officer, and so on. And I advise, train, and audit medium-sized companies within the EU online remotely, and sometimes not only from Malta, but also from other parts of the world.
Yes, absolutely fascinating. We already talked about it in the preliminary discussion, which is also an exciting topic for us. We also have a tie in the survey. We actually have two topics. One is the topic of the transparent human and the topic of awareness. We already talked about it, saying that we want to focus more on the topic of the transparent human today, because we've already talked a lot about awareness, as one doesn't exclude the other. But before we perhaps start with the topic of the transparent human, also in relation to the topic of data protection, what does a transparent human mean to you?
That's a very interesting question. And I would briefly explain what it means from my perspective, because we'll certainly delve into it directly afterwards. So it's like we're simply being spied on by many devices and companies. I would say something along those lines. So basically, we all wear smartwatches. We have smart devices around us. Our cars collect a lot of data about us, about our actions, about what we like, about our needs, desires, and so on, about our daily lives. And yes, there are also data profiles, personalized data profiles that companies collect about us, and based on that, they also influence us in some way. Yes, they influence our purchasing behavior, for example, and exactly in this way, companies have a very, very, very large amount of data about us. And yes, they influence our daily lives, I would say. And that's why it's called the transparent person, because companies have a very, very, very large amount of knowledge about us as individuals.
Now, it's often the case that you hear in the press that Germany places a strong emphasis on data protection, right? Other countries, like China, for example, have a completely different understanding of data protection, also of surveillance. Why is the topic of data protection so important for you, also for us?
Well, many think it's about the GDPR or laws, regulations, and so on. And that's what I originally thought too, actually. That's why I never wanted to work in data protection. And yet, it has much more to do with the fact that we as humans should know what data we give to whom, how it is used, for what purposes, and to whom it is also passed on. So, in principle, it's about knowing for yourself, having the awareness of what actually happens with our data, and also having the rights, yes, to assert these rights, meaning also finding out from companies how do you handle my data? And that's why I like data protection so much, because it's also about giving people a kind of how do you say, oversight over their own data and its usage.
What is always such an important topic for me, especially when we talk about data protection, is also us to some extent the boundaries, or the guidelines. Where do I need to position myself? Because if I have no protection for my data at all, I'm with someone, people always talk about GDPR personal data, but data protection goes much, much further. Then it's also the case that at the end of the day, there's no regulation at all about who can do what with my data, right? So, at the end of the day, and this also relates to the topic of transparent people, we are a form of payment for such providers. So our data, that's the currency, right? And I think many people still don't know or quite understand that in the end, any free application, and I don't want to generalize because there are some that don't do this, but in most cases, if you get something for free on the internet, somewhere for free, the payment for it being free is essentially your data. And for that, you obviously need data protection to regulate it in some way so that in the end, your payment of data doesn't lead to you having given up everything and having no control over it anymore. And I think that's also an important aspect of the topic of the transparent person, because you've already mentioned it, right? Whether we have something like an Apple Watch or a fitness tracker or any websites that have cookies. These are all invisible data traces for the average person that we leave every time on the internet, right? Where conclusions about our behavior can be drawn. The best example is, as I've mentioned several times in the podcast, if we were to talk about lawnmowers 10 times, we would get nothing but more ads about lawnmowers in the coming days, even though we never searched for them before, right? And that's kind of this topic of the transparent human. In the end, this data trail is followed, the information is collected, and then I receive something personalized from the providers according to my statements, but not always something useful that I really need, So that's also a story. On one hand, if we become transparent, we can advertise more targeted, personalized content. But on the other hand, someone has to tell me whether I need it or not. Or another negative example, that you have to pay more if you have an iPhone than if you have an Android phone, Maybe you've experienced this on booking platforms as well. If I go to the booking platform with an iPhone, the hotel costs 200 euros. If I go with an Android phone, the hotel costs 260 or 270 euros. That's, of course, another negative aspect of being a transparent person.
Yes, definitely. You're bringing up really good examples. And you asked me what data protection means to me, and that's exactly it. Having the awareness of how we handle our data, to whom we disclose it, and also knowing what these companies like Apple, Meta, and so on actually do with our data, how they use it. And it's usually the case that when we use free services, our data is often used for training purposes, for example, or other purposes. And essentially, the question is it worth it to us? So is it worth it to us that we pay with our data and in return, we basically get a free service? Or should we rather pay for these services, whether it's €2 or €5 a month, one time, whatever? But in return, our data is secured and not used by the platforms or other services. So essentially, data protection is really much more about being aware of your own data, how it's used, and also protecting yourself.
And what I always find important, just like in cybersecurity, is the balance between usability and ultimately not just security, but also privacy, right? Many people always ask me, hey, Nico, you're a cybersecurity expert. Why do you use Alexa, right? Everyone knows that it's an absolute data monster, right? It collects all the data. I just think, yeah, I don't give a damn if Alexa listens to me while I'm on the toilet or I don't know, whatever else. I don't care. Yeah. Then Alexa gives feedback like, hey, do you want to buy a lawnmower? So Amazon gets the feedback. Yeah, but that's how it is. Usability is more important to me. I just don't want to turn it on and off, or I want everyone who has an Alexa to please turn it off. Otherwise, it will react multiple times because I will mention the word several more times. But I also want to use the functionality with it. However, I'm aware that data is being shared as a result, and that's just how it is. And I think we just need to become more transparent and talk about it, because many people say, no, it doesn't happen. It's not true. This, that, the other. And we are not being listened to, and so on and so forth. And they come up with some special solution that works without Alexa and the like. I can understand all of that, you know. I can also comprehend that it is like that. But for me, the issue of usability is simply more important. I just want to have this usability, but I know in the background that I am giving up a bit of my data privacy for it, you know? That's just how it is. And I think we need to pay attention, especially regarding the transparent person, to what I consciously want to disclose and where I am really treated as a transparent person, where I no longer have any say, you know. The best example is, for instance, with cookies, you know, where I have no say at all, or with something like my smartwatch, which suddenly sends data who knows where, you know. I can't have any say in that either, you know. I also have a firewall at home where I regularly check, even when I introduce a new gadget into the house, how much data is being sent abroad, you know. Even there, you can never be sure if these are some critical data or if these are just data needed to connect to a server, whatever, you know. So you can only partially look at the data packets. But at the end of the day, you have to be aware that in today's world, your data is the currency. It's no coincidence that large companies like Google, Meta, Amazon, and others have become so successful because they can collect a lot of data and thus analyze user behavior. And with this data, they can also control and manage their programs accordingly. And I can only repeat it again. The price of free services, not all services, as I said, not to generalize, but for most, free services is your data, right? Data trading is truly a huge topic in today's digitalized world. Your data is really the most important thing that our data brokers actually sell. And maybe we should get to the topic. Why is data trading so lucrative? What do you think? Why are companies interested in simply trading data?
Yes, that's really fascinating. Because at the beginning, when I started working in data protection, I didn't understand what data trading actually is. And I think you really have to engage with it, and also maybe listen to and read a lot of news about what's happening. So basically, what does data trading mean? It means that Meta and others, Google, yes, companies, they get your data through different means, and then, as you already mentioned, they use this data to, for example, influence your purchasing behavior and also pass on the data. So, for example, we look at cookies. So when you go to a website, then sometimes I am a bit overwhelmed when I see a website and the cookie banner then says, you allow us to share your data with 968 new advertising partners. And I think to myself, okay, good to know that there are indeed so many. And that means if you click on agree or accept, then your data is shared with 968 advertising partners and everything like which website are you on, what interests you, which products did you click on in the online shop, for example, and so on. That all gets passed on to the advertising partners. And then you really get personalized ads, for example, displayed so that your purchasing behavior, in this case, if we are talking about an online shop, is influenced to such an extent that you only see exactly that one pair of pants that you clicked on once or maybe multiple times. And then it also goes beyond other websites as well. It doesn't just stay on the one website, but it essentially transfers to the other websites that you then visit in the future. And yes, that's basically, from my perspective, this data trade that not just one provider knows about your purchasing behavior, your needs, desires, and so on, about what you are currently searching for online, but 968 others as well.
What I find nice, what you mentioned, I've also experienced, especially here in Germany. I don't want to do any name dropping now, but for example, I signed a contract with an energy provider and was totally surprised in the end that they wanted from me. Yes, for advertising purposes, we would like to outsource it to this and that subsidiary, and then to this and that subsidiary. And I mean, they communicated it openly and honestly, right? That has to be said. Before the GDPR, or even with this whole topic of opt-in and opt-out options, which also came about because of it, it wasn't so transparent, right? It might have been somewhere in the privacy policy in the very last chapter, but that you are now so prominently pointed out, right? With some lifestyle LLC and the LLC and the LLC and the LLC. I also think to myself, okay, right, wow, you actually just want to sign an energy supplier contract, and in the end, you get hit with the big advertising club on top from some other things, right, that are related to the energy supplier. Then it has also had another company that took care of this and that, and you didn't see it. And in the end, all these data, if I had agreed, which I didn't, all these data would be passed on to these subsidiaries, and they would have, so to speak, allowed themselves to contact me with advertising. And you do an experiment. I actually did that once because I found it super interesting. I know it's very time consuming, but at the end of the day, I think it's interesting. Everyone who has a Google email address has one. Although Google is also a data collector, but that's another topic, can create multiple labels for free on their email account. This means I can easily track this email address that I have provided here is registered with the portal. How I always do it, I simply take my email address and simply add a word with a plus sign before my email address. So let's take an example. I register with Google, then I would write Google plus my email address, gmail.com. Why does this work? Google has a syntax where they can then say, okay, this word before the plus is essentially my label. And as soon as an email comes from this email address, it is automatically tagged with this label in your inbox. So it's about clarity, right? Of course, you can also do it differently by registering an email address for each provider. That is certainly more laborious because you simply need to have what feels like 100 email addresses. But this way I can use one email address and still know from which provider these data essentially originate. And then I checked if I registered with provider A, where suddenly spam came with the email address I used for provider A. So you had traceability. So which providers are selling my data and where and how does the whole thing work? And then I had some fun. We'll get to that later by exercising my rights as a citizen and requesting information. And that became very interesting. So you also noticed that the companies were then very quick to react and pretended to be dead and definitely didn't want to respond. And let's just leave it. But this way I could track where, when I register on certain portals, where they get their information from and how the whole thing works. And that's maybe a tip for everyone out there who has a Google email address. It certainly works with other providers too. But try tracking what happens with your data when you register somewhere.
That's an exciting point. I still remember that as a teenager. I registered on a lot of sites and, of course, tried out a lot of things and so on. And at least my email address and also other data are still stored with these. Yes, with these providers or platforms. And for years now, I've been going through this radically and actually trying, to free myself. So to delete my data with the providers and also to inquire where they got my data from and what data they have about me and so on. And it is indeed a burden. So I would like to undo everything I did in my youth, so to speak. But that's not so easy and sometimes even not possible, at least not possible at first glance, because the companies, as you already said, would remain completely stationary. They do nothing at this point in time. The main thing is not to react and not to provide any button or any other means of contact. And yes, it's also interesting that after so many years, I'm still chasing after this, and I know exactly that my data is with many companies, and I have no overview at all. And to be honest, it was really creepy to know that I have no overview at all of, my data, the purpose of its use, and the companies that use and further process this data. And that's why the topic of data protection is really important to me, because it's really about knowing your data and knowing where and to whom you pass it on. And be aware that companies, yes, can also do something else with the data, which might not be good for you.
Yes, and you're addressing an important topic. I don't want to scare anyone here, I mentioned that at the beginning, usability versus privacy, or as I always say, usability versus security. One should not shut oneself off from these digital media just because one says, okay, my data is being given away. But as you nicely put it, one should gain awareness to understand what happens with this data, and how do I deal with it. And we have already talked about some things that are considered risks of the transparent person. Let's dive a little deeper into that. About one topic we haven't talked about at all, which I increasingly see and was also part of various federal elections or generally presidential elections, is the topic of manipulation. When I collect data about someone, I can, of course, also manipulate place ads or try to achieve political influence by knowing, okay, how does the person think and what do I show them now, preferably? This has, for example, the TikTok algorithm did extremely during our federal election with election advertising from a certain party, where I would say you get shown it, even though I haven't given anything politically to this party or informed myself about it. But because the content matches what you're currently engaging with, not necessarily the party content, but generally the topics being discussed, the algorithm played it out to someone, right? And that is precisely a danger I see in the transparent human. And there you can certainly share your experience on this, that naturally when one becomes transparent, it becomes easier to find ways to influence or even manipulate you.
Exactly. So the more data companies, platforms, services, and so on have, the more you are influenced. And the most important thing is not to let yourself be influenced. And that is also very difficult, yes. Yes. So basically what you said is already happening daily. Yes, when you go on social media platforms, whether TikTok or Instagram and so on, you are very manipulated there because you watched a video or looked at a post, and then you are shown additional similar posts, and it just keeps going like that. If you click on this post, it will continue like that because the algorithm learns. It learns how long you stay on this post, how you interact with it, where you click, what interests you. Do you also comment? Do you like it? Do you share this post and so on? And thus the algorithm learns, okay, she or he likes this. And then we feed more of these or similar contents into the feed. And in principle, it is really a manipulation. And it's important to have a certain level of media literacy, because if you truly understand that, that how the algorithm works, and what they do with your data and how they use it, and then you can handle it much better and be less influenced by it. And sometimes it's really like that. That I, for example, just for a few days, I simply don't turn on social media for myself. Then the algorithm more or less usually fades away and somehow shifts to other topics. But when I'm back on social media and I look at a post again, then it starts all over again. And I have to, I sometimes just have to smile because I also know how it all works. And on the other hand, since you also talked about risks, it is really very risky if we are heavily influenced by it. For example, before the federal election, if you frequently get content from a certain party, it doesn't matter which one, in your feed, then your mind just notices it multiple times. And the more often you get these contents fed into your feed, the more often you will think, oh yes, exactly that. That's what I need or want, or that's exactly what I would also say or even vote for. And thus, you basically get caught in a whirlpool. Well, at least I know it in such a way that I then get caught in a whirlpool and think more about this one party, for example, than about all the others that still exist and can also be voted for. Exactly because of that. A certain level of media literacy is important to distinguish where I am being manipulated and what truly interests me.
Yes, you're addressing an important topic there. I have already covered that in the podcast. The power of the media should not be underestimated, right? Especially social media like TikTok and others, for the younger generation, where I'm also represented with my podcast, I believe you can always see a certain influence behind it. Another important topic for me, especially when we're talking about the transparent human, is of course the issue that if I am already so transparent and then there is a data leak or my data becomes available, I often have the problem of identity theft, right? So that's also a topic for me that needs to be considered. If we are already so transparent, then I also have a problem when my data leaks, as it can be misused for identity theft, right? I see it again and again. Maybe you know this too. When you go on eBay classified or now it's no longer called eBay classifieds, but just classifieds, and you sell things or do something, where very often suddenly ID photos of other people or information are shared by, let's say, criminal organizations and so on and so forth. Where I always want to raise awareness to think about what data I am actually sharing in such a, let's say, anonymized chat, right? Because clearly I don't know the person on the other side, and I don't know what they will do with my ID data or my address data. I can definitely only warn everyone, do not send any ID data or personal information through classifieds or other platforms, because you never know who is on the other side. And I can tell you, such data quickly ends up on the darknet, on corresponding platforms, exchange platforms, or also on platforms where you can buy such things, buy data sets, which are then always misused. And fortunately, I personally haven't had the case where my identity was stolen, but I know people where it has happened, and it's not a pleasant topic, you know. When you suddenly receive packages that you can't do anything about, or suddenly get negative credit entries because someone has misused your information, and then you have to fight to get those entries removed. All unpleasant things that I wouldn't wish on anyone, but where you also have to be careful, because if you're a bit careless, it's easier for perpetrators to access such information, which can then be leaked in a data breach.
Definitely there too. I actually had several incidents myself. Yes, experienced on eBay classifieds when I was, for example, looking for apartments. And it was such that I received IDs. Yes, of course, not the real IDs. Yes. And the person I was dealing with wanted to basically convince me that they were indeed the person identified on the ID, and that I could already transfer the deposit, and so on. Yes, even before I had actually viewed the apartment. And I, well, I don't know, it was then very late one evening, and I thought, okay, he then told me another story. He has to go to London because there's some aunt there, and he can't show me the apartment, and so on. He also sent me, as I said, this ID so that I would really believe that it's him. The next day, well, I had to sleep on it because I was somehow stunned. Yes. The next day I looked at the pictures again, checked the apartment address again, and compared the various data once more and realized, no, this is a scam. Yes, because the pictures don't match the house or the surroundings at all. And fortunately, I had already been there personally, so I could assess it better. The story with the aunt and so on also seemed strange to me, so I actually left it alone. And fortunately, otherwise, if I had made a transfer or sent my my ID card or other data, they would have ended up with someone who, yes, could basically steal my identity. And as you said, yes, make some purchases with, yes. So with, well, so many things come to mind right now. Yes, he can just do almost anything because he can identify himself as you, the person. And that's really creepy. And luckily, I realized early on that something was wrong. And there was also, well, I don't know how it is currently, but I remember back then, I also participated in some contests. And even there, I was then called, and I was asked to please provide my bank details over the phone because I had won something. They couldn't explain to me what I had actually won, where they got my data from, but I had won something, and they asked me to please provide my bank details so they could send me a credit or a prize amount or whatever. It was very exciting. I also fortunately didn't do any of that, but you see, I was on various sites back then as a teenager and was often called also experienced a lot myself, which is why, as I've mentioned several times in this podcast, data protection is so important to me, because I personally realized what can happen and how much power others have over me when they get my data, and then it becomes a difficult process to change your own data. Well, you can still change bank details, yes. My own identity is difficult to change. That's why we should be more careful.
I made the special move. I changed my name. Now I'm anonymous again.
Okay, you can also get married and change your name for sure.
Exactly. Absolutely. No, but you speak to a topic that resonates with me. We are all human. I am just as much a human, and I fall for such things just the same, both in the cybersecurity field and in the data protection area. I think the most important thing we have to admit to ourselves, and I really mean everyone, is that nowadays it's more sophisticated than ever, right? Thankfully, it was mentioned with IDs, right? Nowadays, you can already forge invoices and IDs using ChatGPT. So what AI brings with it is gigantic, right? And we are just at the beginning of it, right? So I believe that the perpetrators who do such things, including identity theft, will become even more sophisticated than they have ever been before. And that one simply has to protect oneself. And the best protection, which I always say, is common sense. Just think about it. Does this really make sense, right? If I am supposed to pay money for an apartment that I have never seen, never visited, or whatever, is that a practical tactic? Or is it simply not a practical tactic? My recommendation is also, no matter what you do, just Google it, right? Just Google, is this, for example, a tactic that is used abroad, right? Especially when you are in countries where you have no clue, right? Just Google, is this a common practice? If Google then shows, not just in one article, but in several articles, yes, this is a common practice, okay, then you might see it in a completely different light, right? But at the end of the day, I think it's always a matter of common sense. And maybe also, as you said, sleeping on it. Is this sensible? Is it perhaps not so sensible? Of course, one can also understand because the insidious thing about such people is simply that they exploit the needs of others. They exploit the needs of people looking for apartments. They exploit the needs of people, perhaps also older people who have no idea about technology. I always find it terrible that money is made from people who simply might not know any better, right? And that's why this topic of talking about it and raising awareness is a matter close to my heart, because we are all human and humans simply make mistakes. And especially when we talk about identity theft, it's always important to me. IDs have absolutely no place on the internet. So, no authority will ask you to send any kind of ID, whatever it may be. Yes, maybe it can be for legitimization, but at the end of the day, always check whether it makes sense or not. And if in doubt, do it in person, go there personally, and have your ID copied.
It's a better way than doing it somehow over the internet. But also an important point, especially on the topic of transparent people, is the issue of scoring systems, and also the issue of discrimination, which has increasingly come up in recent times as companies have realized that they can make money with scoring, right? Whether it's, for example, an insurance company or, which I find a super strange topic. There are certainly pros and cons to the fact that there are now car insurers who say, I'll install a box in your car that analyzes your driving behavior, whether you drive fast, less fast, whether you brake less, whatever. And based on a score value that comes out of it, we calculate your insurance premium, right? Everything can have advantages and disadvantages, but it also shows me to some extent where scoring systems can lead. Namely that you have become so transparent that others can do something with the data, right? And scoring always has a bit of a discriminatory connotation for me to some extent if you use it incorrectly.
Yes, definitely. I still remember that when I passed my driving test, I immediately bought my car, and an insurance company told me that for young drivers, you can install a box, just like you just mentioned, for I think 2 or 3 years, or as long as the probation period lasts exactly. And then they will basically analyze my driving style, how I drive, what I do, when I brake, and so on, the whole driving behavior. Yes. And based on that, they will also determine damage classes. How do you say it?
No claims classes.
Exactly. Based on that, the no claims class will be adjusted again. And then the question came to me, how is it actually with data protection? What about my own personal data? What happens if someone else, drives my car? Because that can happen too. What if I wasn't the one at fault in an accident, for example, but someone else was, and all of that is analyzed? What if I really braked very late because there was no other way and because someone cut in front of me? Yes, there were so many questions that I just thought, no, I'm not going to have that installed now, because it could backfire on me so negatively that I would be judged based on that, based on my behavior, and then based on the behavior of the other parties in traffic. And in general, that wasn't convincing for me at all. And I asked, how is it actually with data protection? They told me, don't worry, it's all sorted out.
That's always the best statement when it comes to data protection. No worries at all. Just sign. We do data protection.
Yes. So they told me, I think it's something like, yes, your data is stored on an EU server and we don't do anything else with your data. Oh, yes, of course. But analyzing my face and based on that, determining something that can be very significant for me, yes.
But you're already addressing an important topic that I see repeatedly. Many people only pay attention to where my data is stored, but that's not really relevant to me. Of course, it is relevant whether they are stored in America or not, but at the end of the day, I want to know what happens with my data. But the first statement is always like, no problem at all. We have a German data center in Frankfurt, certified to such and such extent, and that's how it is. And my next question is then, what happens to the data? And there's no answer to that. Yes, I have to inquire, right? So there, you can already see a bit of this focus. It's initially important to say that the data is processed in Europe or in Germany at all. What happens with the data is then more like another chapter of the book.
Exactly. And I still remember that my data wouldn't have stayed only with this one insurance company, but they also work with other partners. I don't even know for what purposes. I just know there were definitely other partner companies that also received my data and did whatever with it. And it seemed at first glance, yes, when you go to the website and read there, yes, young drivers can have such a box installed and they even pay less. Yes, a lower monthly premium for the insurance. That sounds pretty cool at first when you read it on the website. But when I got some advice, because my parents taught me to always seek good advice, no question is stupid. You must ask every question if you have it. And then during the conversation, I found out more and more that somehow everything isn't as cool as what they write on the website.
Yes. Oh, I think it's another example of what you have to be aware of with the transparent person, right? At first glance, it's a cool offer, low price, this, that, the other. But what really happens with this data? And You've mentioned the cases, right? If someone else is driving the show and suddenly decides, oh, let's do some donuts or I'll drift for a round or whatever, on all of that is stored with my profile, right? What happens there? How is the transparency? So that's an important point for me as well. Before we perhaps switch to the topic of what my protection mechanisms are and the laws that are supposed to protect me from the reader of people, maybe let's revisit this topic of transparency, right? So I also need to somehow understand what happens to my data. For example, how is the algorithm that calculates whether I'm a good driver or a bad driver, right? You've already mentioned some examples, right? Driving behavior, especially when an accident occurs, in the end, only a court can decide whether I am now the accident suspect or the perpetrator, in quotes. In my life, I've experienced dozens of cases as I drive a lot, both personally and professionally, where I always thought, hey, this is a clear situation. In court, it's a different situation, and suddenly you're partially at fault, or you share the blame, or didn't you see it? So a box can't decide that, right? The context is missing there. I find that very difficult, but we've already talked about the topic. Let's talk again about what laws and protective mechanisms exist for me to prevent this transparent person, or to make the transparent person not as transparent as some multinational corporations might want.
First of all, we have the GDPR. Now let's get to the legal aspect. That is also something that plays a role and gives us humans rights. And in the GDPR, and due to this, also among other things, you can also assert your rights with the respective company, sometimes even legally enforce them. But let's say we inquire whether they, for example, have our data or where they got it from, what happens to the data, to whom are these data sent? Yes, to which partner companies? We are allowed to ask about everything that happens with our data, know about our data records, and also receive a copy of them. We are also allowed to have the data deleted or adjusted, or receive complete copy of these data, and so on. So in principle, we have many options if we are aware of them, and it is very relevant to make use of these of our rights, and to acquire the knowledge that we that we have these rights. Otherwise, what also helps us is if we surf the internet mindfully, for example, and don't just click yes and amen on every cookie banner. So just take the time to read through and take a moment. What does the cookie banner actually say? To whom are these data actually supposed to be passed on? And also, who is it? Press reject and see what happens. There are also a few plugins you can install to see which cookies are still being celebrated. But that's getting too technical now.
Yes, but I might intervene there because I see it the same way, because I wouldn't trust these cookie banner options. I've seen it on various websites. You said no, and yet it still happens. So my recommendation to you is get the appropriate apps, right? Privacy Badger, AdBlock Plus, and whatever they're all called. There are thousands of options that really block the cookies in the end and not the website itself. So that's my recommendation, because I've seen time and again, no matter what you choose there, in the end, the cookies are still loaded.
Yes, definitely. And so basically, exactly, the plugins are definitely good, so that we also have the awareness when we're on social media that we don't let ourselves be influenced. Yes, that we also know exactly, okay, this feed is being shown to us because we looked at this and that, but we can also adjust the feed again because we are the masters of the feed in this case and can also say, okay, now let's show something else. Yes. And at the same time, we can also adjust settings, for example. So in the apps on the platforms, in the various services, that our data should not be used for training purposes, for example, or that the data should be stored on an EU server and should not be shared outside of the EU. That advertising partners are not involved in this, and so on. So in principle, we have many options. So that technically, legally, but also I would say from our own understanding, yes, we can protect ourselves and also have many options to ensure that our data stays with us and is only used for the purposes for which it should be used.
You are addressing a very important topic, Mo, which we have already discussed repeatedly today, namely common sense, right? Or as you said, just thinking about it. Is it necessary? I always give a classic example. An app, my wife recently installed a game, and the game wanted access to the camera, wanted access to the location, wanted access to this. Why does a game need that? Maybe we should question that, right? I mean, we live in a fast modern world. We all have no time, and we just keep clicking next, 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 next. The main thing is we want to play the game, but really taking a minute to say, hey, why does it need access to the camera? Why does it need access to my location? Why does it need access to this? Developing this awareness and then simply saying, no, I don't need it. I don't allow it. I don't allow it. I don't allow it. The game will still work. But all these data collection functions, and to be fair, we have to say you can never deactivate everything, right? So even if we make the settings in good faith, there are always some settings in the background that probably still let data flow out. But this conscious saying no, I think that's an important step that we should gradually instill in people's minds. So also the mindset, right? I always call it a mindset change in the head for cybersecurity. I see exactly the same for data protection. But also conversely, understanding the mindset change that sometimes I have to collect data. For example, when we look at law enforcement agencies, right? It's always being criticized and so to speak, hey, we must not become a surveillance state. Yes. Yeah. I also believe that, but if we want to confront the current threats, then a state must also have the ability to collect data from violent offenders, criminals, terrorists, whatever, and not always have to go across the pond with a phone and ask, hey, do you know this person or do you have anything on them? Or also get information from them. Oh, by the way, the terrorist is active again in your area. So again, this is about usability privacy. One must also consider that data collection sometimes has to be necessary to take action against such offenders or threats. And in the private sector, one should also think about whether the game really needs the camera or if the game eventually needs the location.
And for you, the difference is that you also use Alexa, for example, and you are aware that Alexa collects your data. You are aware that when you talk about pants, then your Amazon account suddenly has a lot of advertisements for pants because you need one right now. Yes. So as long as you are aware of that, then everything is fine. But I see that many people just click accept on everything. I see that they simply say, well, I have nothing to hide. They say yes. They just say, well, that's just how it is. Then I just pass on my data to other people, to other companies. They can do whatever they want with it. And they don't have this awareness. They don't actively say yes to it with a consciously active yes. But I don't know, is that ignorance? Or is it simply that they don't want to deal with it?
I think it's just resignation. It's resignation. Because you say the global corporations out there, they get my data anyway, and I'm with you. That's a very nice example you gave. I consciously say yes, because I say, I want to use it that way. I want to use it like that, and I am aware of the consequences. And there are many out there who consciously say, no, they say yes, but not out of awareness because they know, but from the point because they have already resigned and said, well, I can't do anything about them having my data anyway. And there I agree with you. Maybe the way is to come to this conscious yes. Or if I then say, no, I don't want it after all, then to do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I would say maybe in conclusion, also as a little thought-provoking impulse for everyone out there, one should engage much more with the topic of privacy and also consider how much of it I want to disclose or how much I want to give up, right? Especially the topic we talked about, consciously deciding to give up a part of my privacy in exchange for having this usability. And also, if you are addressing this team of readers and saying, I don't want this at all, then also consider whether you can use the usability of the website if you don't share the data and what you can ultimately do yourself. As you have already mentioned, is to look at the settings, privacy settings. What I also like to do is use VPN services. Nowadays, they are easier to access than ever before. To simply employ a bit of obfuscation tactics. But at the end of the day, it's the usage behavior that determines how much privacy I give up and which privacy I want to keep.
You summarized that very well. And I also want to say that we should pay much more attention to which services we really need. So do we really need all of that, right? Does it all have to be? I've even deleted many apps and keep deleting new ones. Outdated apps that I no longer need. And I keep checking which smart devices I need, which services, platforms, and so on do I no longer use, and I deactivate and delete them to create a bit more space. And we haven't really talked about it, but I've noticed that since I emigrated, I've fully embraced minimalism, and I apply that to data protection as well. Living completely minimalistically, and it's very liberating, to be honest. It's strange, but also very liberating that I pay more attention to what I need, what is really necessary, and what is just, makes my life nicer, but isn't necessary, and I can do without.
Yes, and what I always have to add to that is, from the outside, it sometimes looks like you're giving everything away. I also have this issue as an influencer, as they always say, that many people think everything I post, everything I say is also just private for me or becomes part of my private life. Yes, private content is shared, like, for example, with the name change, because it's not possible otherwise. Otherwise, everyone would wonder why there's a new name. But at the end of the day, I decide what I share and what I don't share. And from the outside, it always looks like I share everything. No matter where I am, I share it. But I do so many things that no one knows about. And I think that's always a bit of awareness that you have to keep in mind. Just because you read something about someone, but doesn't mean that's everything. There is certainly a private side to people that you don't know about. And that should be respected in the end. I think that's also an important point, this give and take. You do share a lot of information, boys, but you must always understand that some information simply isn't shared. And especially when it comes to the transparent person, it always involves making a conscious decision about what I want to share and what not. I definitely want to thank you for allowing us to have such an exciting discussion on this topic. And I would say that's it for this episode of Cybersecurity Chefsache. So we'll hear and see each other next time. Until then.
Thank you for having me as well, really.